So this is Prospects of Music Derived from Biometric Data as a Tool for Therapy by Amaya Caudel under the advisory of Dakila Ledesma and Yu Liang for iCompBio at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga. So to introduce my own project, I'll first explain a bit about Dr. Liang's project to sort of contextualize what I'm doing. This IBM project, or Interpretation of Biometric Data Using Immersive and Self-Perceived Music, is essentially about taking data from your own body and turning it into an immersive piece of music. An example shown here is kinematic data from your body movements, which is what Dr. Liang's team have worked on so far. So there are 4 modules that different groups of people work on to make a contribution to this project. In Module 1, you derive a pristine piece of music from the biometric data. And pristine is to say it's sort of like the skeleton of the product and not quite a complete music piece. This has been done with a handful of methods such as autoencoder neural network AI, perceiver AR, autoregressive AI, and signal processing techniques. After that, you get to Module 2, which is where you make the music meaningful. This could be adding emotional context through sentiment analysis, contextualizing the music with socioeconomic and diagnostic information, or even just using diffusion neural network AI to generate a better sounding piece of music, like adding extra streams to the skeleton that can make it sound more meaningful. In Module 3, you take multiple of the created streams and fit them together into a symphony. This can be done with algorithmic composition involving time sequencing neural network AI. Once you have your audio complete, the final step, Module 4, is to make that music immersive by visualizing it in VR. The VR environment can be made in a game-creating software called Unity with a number of visual elements such as AI-generated imagery or an automated spectrum audio visualization generator. And now you may be wondering, this all sounds great, but what is it for? Well, besides recreational art purposes, this conversion from biometric data to multisensory music can make a great tool for therapeutical purposes. There's a central hypothesis in this project that everything is music, and that specifically there's a link or resonance between musical patterns and patterns of a human system. People contributing to this project would be music therapists and neurologists covering the medicinal side, computer scientists and audio engineers covering the technological side, and performing artists and musicians covering the musical and artistic side of it. The people who could benefit from this project are medical service providers, patients suffering from physical or mental health issues, and researchers of AI and medical science. The prime function of this multisensory music piece is to provide a sort of therapeutic resonance for doctors and patients to use to treat a number of ailments like anxiety, depression, or chronic pain. Another potential use for this music could be to provide diagnostic information pending further research and discoveries. Now moving on to what I did this summer, my project was a kind of solo project that I worked on by myself, branching off of Dr. Liang's. Key differences are that his group has mostly been working with kinematic data so far for music derived from biometric data, and my project is unique in that they haven't done anything with EEG or EKG data before. I also took a direct one-to-one conversion approach when making my music, instead of integrating any AI methods that would alter the source material. This was because I wanted the product to stay faithful to the source. Another difference is that his project is designed to be completely automated and mine was done manually by myself. But that's not to say it couldn't be automated, it definitely could be developed upon. So getting into the source of the data I used for my own project, I was actually in a unique position where I had data from my own body out there that had been taken by the Autism Laboratory of Affective Sensory Research. I had participated in one of their studies a little over a year ago, and they were generous enough to send me the EEG and EKG data that they had taken over a 5-minute long resting period. The EEG cap is pictured here on the right, measuring my brain's electric signals, and unpictured here was an EKG attached at my chest, measuring my heartbeat. Another thing they had done was MRI imaging of my brain, which I used for the title image of this presentation and can possibly serve as the visuals for a music video of my EEG music. Now, the first challenge I faced in this project was in accessing the data itself. I wasn't provided with a way to open the type of folder I had, so it took a trial and error with many random programs I found online before I got one that accepted my file type. The one I landed on was this software called EEG Lab, created by the Swartz Center for Computational Neuroscience. It's a MATLAB-based software that's able to open all kinds of little windows and plots that were encoded into the data folder using this little home-based directory window. So this plot shows the number index of each of the electrodes in the cap and where they were positioned on my head, and this jumbled mess is all 128 electrode streams of the EEG. And this consistent one in the center is the EKG heartbeat. The most valuable tool I was able to use from this software was exporting this plot in number values into a CSV file, which lists each of these data points in a way so that they can be converted directly into an array with rows and columns. So, I had started with an MFF folder containing the EEG data, and then EEG Lab was able to export it as a CSV file, and then this Python-based software called Jupyter Lab was able to access the data values so that I could work with them. They're formatted kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, and then I could access each electrode stream by importing it into just one column at a time into an array variable. Then I could modify it or plot it over time, or whatever I needed to do with it. This last stream in my spread is called ECG, but that's the same thing as EKG. Some people just spell them differently due to a translation issue, but they both need the same thing. So from here, I could plot a clean scatter plot of each electrode stream that was easier to see than in EEG Lab. This group plot shows electrodes 11 through 20, and looking at them, I was able to pick ones that looked like they could produce a nice sound for my music piece. These really flat ones, like blue, yellow, and green, probably couldn't produce anything musically interesting, but these spiky ones with more movement look like they could tell a sort of musical story like red and pink. So these were the two electrode streams I chose for my music, E2 and E14. They both have big peaks at about the same time, at about 125 seconds and about 250 seconds, but they also both have pretty different streams surrounding those peaks, like here and here, so they look like they would complement each other well. The way Jupyter Lab can convert this data into playable music is that you can normalize the data stream from 0 to 1 and then map those values to music note numbers that range from 36 to 82. These whole numbers correspond to pitch values as shown in this chart. The note numbers ascend in pitch from lower to higher, so they can make for a direct translation of the data into pitch. Now, because the data has to be rounded up or down to a whole number for each note, there is a bit of data loss going into the notes, which was another thing to consider when picking the electrode streams. It needed to vary enough that when converted, it still sounds interesting and not just one pitch being mashed for a long time, like the flat streams I showed in my earlier example. Once this is exported as a MIDI file, it's a plot over time where each point has a pitch and a volume. Now this is a representation of that MIDI file once it's been loaded into this music editing software called FL Studio. This stream against the piano represents the pitch, and this stream below it represents the volume. The pitch is completely dependent on the data, mapped from its minimum to its maximum, and the volume is only slightly varied. It ranges from a high enough volume to a slightly higher volume for the peaks. The instrument I chose for this was a built-in one called Cloud Formation. It sounds like this. And the way it sort of recursively builds onto itself makes it a good fit for these long sections where it makes the same pitch. If you chose an instrument like piano chords, like this, it doesn't sound quite right. So the instrument you choose is a really important part of this process and the quality of the music you produce. Now, as for the heartbeat, it was handled a little bit differently than the EEG streams because it's supposed to be a beat, not a melody. Instead of mapping it to a number of pitch notes, it was set to a consistent note of 60, and then the volume was mapped to the data stream instead of pitch. And this pattern looks a little bit hard to see, but it's just going up and down in a typical heartbeat shape, just very compressed. Now, because of the way the volume is mapped, I needed each dip to have the same minimum to correspond to volume equals 0. This was accomplished by simply cropping the vertical axis down until there was a consistent line at the bottom of the normalized version so that you know each dip is touching 0. This makes sure there's a moment of silence between each beat so it can sound like a typical beat. The uncropped version on the left sounded like a complete muddy mess. Then, cropping it at -200 in the middle sounded a little better but still muffled. Then, cropping it at 100 in the right left it sounding much better with minimal muffledness. And this is how that heartbeat looked in FL Studio. On the piano pitch screen, it's just one note and you can see the silence in between each beat. Then, the volume you can see is mapped completely to that final crop dataset in the earlier slide. The cropping method wasn't perfect, so you can still see imperfections here in the results, but mostly the beats look and sound consistent. The messy spike in this chunk here corresponds to one of the EEG spikes. Because they overlap, the muffle in the beat is drowned out by the swell of the music anyways at points where it sounds most imperfect. The instrument that worked best for this stream was surprisingly jazz guitar. It sounds perfect, like you're listening to a real heartbeat in someone's chest. Other instruments, like this one called E-Piano Live, just didn't sound right. Because this whole stream is just one pitch mashed forever, picking the right instrument was kind of tricky. I had to just listen to each one in the library to find the one that sounded best. And finally, this is the completed piece of composed music with electrode 2, electrode 14, and the EKG heartbeat data. It's a little over 5 minutes long in total because it's in real time, and that's the length of the rest period over which the data was taken. So this is just a snippet of the first activity spike and the lull surrounding it. So, circling back to Dr. Liang's multisensory therapy project, this method of music production with the EEG and EKG data can be a helpful tool for creating music therapy in live time. Because it's a one-to-one conversion rather than needing any AI generation, this method can process input and display output with less processing power needed. A functional example of something like this being done before is music generated by mushrooms. The user hooks in the electrical signal sensor and immediately the mushroom signals are able to start playing music. You can imagine a possibility for music therapy would be that you go into the therapist's office, put on the EEG cap and EKG sensor, and almost immediately can start producing music just like the mushrooms. Just like with my own music project, an important user decision in both of these examples is the instrument that the signal plays. You'll hear this kind of echoey effect, and that was definitely an artistic choice someone made to make the output sound better. So this is the first little example. And this is the second. Another artistic choice that can be made ahead of time is considering which electrodes are actually making the music. Looking back at this group plot I had shown before of the E11 to E20 electrode streams, there's actually a correlation between the overall shape of the data and the position of the electrode. Towards the top of the head, the yellow, green, orange, and blue light patterns are very flat and sort of uninteresting in this cluster, so you wouldn't want to use those. But then the pink, red, gray, purple, and brown streams towards the forehead have those nice defined spikes of activity here. This would be an important factor to consider when doing something like making EEG music in live time for therapy. Which electrodes will make interesting streams of music so that you can pick those indexes ahead of time and have the digital instruments set to only play those streams. So, my conclusions for the prospects of music derived from biometric data as a tool for therapy are that EEG and EKG data can be converted into pleasant and sonically interesting music. There isn't currently a quantifiable way I have of validating the quality of this music. That can just be up to each viewer's personal discretion of whether or not they think it sounds good. That can also be a factor in implementing further steps, is giving patients a choice of instruments to choose for their generated music so that it can sound most pleasing to them personally, since this is a very subjective matter. My other conclusion is that the direct conversion method I used yields potential for lifetime music therapy from EEG and EKG data streams. Because the conversion process is so simple, a computer could do it much quicker than if it was taking time to think it out and alter the music with AI. Also, an important disclaimer that this is not a project proposal and is not intended to be used as such. This is just a summary of what I've done as a student in the iCompBio REU at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga. For my acknowledgments, I'd like to sincerely thank Dactyla Ledesma, or Dax, for lending an ear to my frustrations in this project and helping me stand up for myself when I felt disrespected and unheard. Being able to talk things out with him has been an important factor in maintaining my sanity. I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding iCompBio and the Autism LASR Lab for providing me with the EEG and EKG data. Lastly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your attention. And here are my sources.